My name is Hannah. I am in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe as steady, reliable, the kind of woman who doesn't raise her voice, who listens more than she speaks, who remembers birthdays and deadlines and quiet promises. I've been a wife, a professional, the emotional glue in rooms where no one noticed the glue until it stopped holding. People tend to underestimate women like me, not because we're weak, but because we're calm, because we don't announce our limits, because we don't express our pain in ways that make others uncomfortable. I've often been mistaken for someone who would tolerate anything, simply because I didn't fight loudly against everything. This story isn't about a dramatic ending. There was no screaming match, no slammed doors, no single moment where everything shattered. My marriage didn't end with a fight. It ended with silence. That sentence took me years to understand. For a long time, I believed marriages ended in obvious ways: betrayal, cruelty, some unmistakable rupture. I didn't realize they could also end the way mine did, gradually, quietly, almost politely. One day, we simply stopped trying, and neither of us noticed when it happened. What I'm sharing with you is not a revenge story. It's not about winning or humiliating anyone. It's about emotional justice. The kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand applause, and doesn't need an audience to be real. This is a story about how being overlooked can slowly turn into being erased, about how silence can feel imposed at first, and then chosen, about the subtle shift that happens when you stop asking to be seen and start seeing clearly instead. Over the next chapters, I'll take you through the emotional landscape of a marriage that didn't collapse, but faded. I'll show you the small moments that seemed insignificant at the time, the ways I learned to normalize being unheard, the role I was quietly assigned, and the day I realized I no longer wanted to play it. There are no villains here, no heroes either. Just people, patterns, and consequences. I'm telling this story because I know how many of us are living inside similar silences, wondering if we're imagining them, minimizing them, or somehow responsible for them. If you've ever felt invisible in a relationship that looks fine from the outside, you'll recognize parts of yourself here. I promise honesty, not drama, not bitterness, and certainly not spectacle. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently, without judgment. Have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized the ending didn't arrive all at once, but quietly, while no one was paying attention? Before anything went wrong, before silence had a name, I was useful. That's the word I would use now. Not loved, not cherished, not even fully known. Useful. To my husband, I was the person who remembered things, so he didn't have to. I kept track of bills, social plans, and family obligations. I knew which moods meant stress and which ones meant exhaustion. I adjusted myself accordingly. I became fluent in anticipation. To his family, I was easy, low maintenance, the one who didn't create tension. I listened more than I spoke at dinners. I helped clear plates without being asked. I sent thank you messages afterward, always warm, never demanding. I was often praised, but never deeply engaged with. Compliments floated above me, never landing. At work, I was dependable. The person's project somehow worked around. If something went wrong, I fixed it quietly. If something went right, the credit moved upward. I didn't protest. I told myself that competence spoke for itself. And in my marriage, I was the steady background hum that made everything else possible. From the outside, our life looked balanced, calm. We didn't fight. People admired that. You two are so mature, they'd say, so stable. I used to smile when they said it. I thought stability was the same as safety. What they didn't see was how rarely anyone asked me what I wanted. Not in big, dramatic ways, but in the small, daily ones that actually build a life. Where to spend holidays, how to arrange our evenings, whether I was tired or just quiet. Decisions happened around me, not with me. And because I rarely objected, everyone assumed agreement. I wasn't invisible in the obvious sense. People saw me, they just didn't check for me. I learned early on that being agreeable made things smoother, that expressing disappointment complicated the rooms, that silence preserved harmony. So I became good at swallowing things before they could form into words. I told myself it was emotional intelligence. I told myself I was choosing peace. But peace built on one person constantly yielding isn't peace. It's erosion. The strange thing is, I didn't feel like a victim. Not at all. I felt responsible, important even. Things worked because I worked. That gave me purpose. And purpose can be a powerful distraction from absence. If I ever felt a flicker of resentment, I dismissed it quickly. Other people had real problems. Other marriages had shouting, betrayal, and chaos. Mine was calm, predictable, functional. Who complains about that? So I learned to translate my needs into inconveniences and then quietly remove them. I told myself love didn't need constant affirmation, that adulthood was about compromise, that wanting more connection was immature. I intellectualized my loneliness until it sounded reasonable. Looking back, I can see how carefully I was being shaped by expectations I never agreed to out loud, but accepted through repetition. I became the wife who would understand, the woman who wouldn't make a big deal, the presence that filled gaps without ever taking up space. And here's the part that's hardest to admit. I helped train them to see me this way every time I let something slide. Every time I answered, "It's fine," when it wasn't. Every time I softened my truth so others could stay comfortable. I was teaching people how little it took to keep me, not because I didn't have needs, but because I didn't believe anyone was listening closely enough to hear them. At the time, I thought this made me strong. Now I know it made me quiet. And quiet, over time, can start to sound like consent, even when it isn't. The first small cut didn't look like a wound. That's why it stayed with me. It happened on an ordinary evening, one of those nights that barely deserve a memory. We were sitting at the kitchen table, plates pushed aside, talking about an upcoming weekend. Nothing important, no tension, just logistics. I mentioned, almost casually, that I had been feeling stretched thin lately. Not overwhelmed, not dramatic, just tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. I remember choosing my words carefully, the way I always did. Light, non-accusatory, trimmed of any sharp edges. He didn't look up right away. When he did, he smiled, kindly even, and said, "You always say that. You're just overthinking again." He meant it gently. "I'm sure of that." There was no malice in his voice, no irritation, just certainty. The conversation moved on. That was it. No argument. No apology needed, apparently. The moment passed so quickly that if I had tried to name it as hurt, it would have sounded excessive. So I didn't. But something inside me registered it, not as anger, more like a quiet recalibration, a mental note filed away without commentary. This is how this will be handled. Later, when I replayed the moment, I tried to be fair. He was probably tired. He probably thought he was reassuring me, telling me not to worry. That's what I told myself. That's what I always told myself. Still, I noticed that he hadn't asked a follow-up question. Not, "Why are you feeling stretched? Is there something I can help with?" Not even, "When did this start?" Just a conclusion. Delivered gently. Case closed. At the time, I didn't confront it because there was nothing obvious to confront. How do you argue with something so mild? How do you accuse someone of harm when the words were soft and the intention seemed good? So I swallowed it. In the days that followed, I noticed myself adjusting, slightly, instinctively. I stopped mentioning fatigue. I reframed stress as busyness. I edited myself before speaking, anticipating which versions of my inner life would be accepted and which would be quietly dismissed. No one else noticed. Why would they? Nothing happened. That's the danger of the first small cut. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't even hurt right away. It just teaches you something. It teaches you what kind of truths are welcome. A week later, I told a friend about the exchange, laughing it off as I recounted it. She shrugged and said, "That's just how men are. Don't read into it." And just like that, the moment was socially erased. Everyone else ignored it, but I remembered it. Not because it was devastating, but because it was clarifying. I began to notice similar moments after that. Comments that landed just a little off. Reactions that subtly redirected conversations away from my interior world. Each one is small enough to be dismissed on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I wasn't ready to name yet. Still, I didn't push back. I told myself that harmony mattered more than precision. That love wasn't about dissecting every interaction. That being easy was a virtue. But something had shifted, a barely perceptible tightening, a sense that certain doors inside me were safer kept closed. The first small cut didn't make me angry. It made me careful. And care, when it's born from self-protection rather than trust, changes the way you show up long before anyone realizes you've changed at all. Once you survive the first small cut, the next ones don't register as danger. They register as normal. That's how it happens. Not all at once, not dramatically. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It slips in disguised as humor, practicality, and realism. It borrows the language of love and wears the tone of familiarity. After that night at the kitchen table, I began to notice how often my inner life was summarized for me. If I was quiet, I was just tired. If I was frustrated, I was taking things too personally. If I disagreed, I was stressed from work. There was always an explanation that didn't require curiosity. And the strange thing is, I accepted them. Sometimes I even repeated them myself, as if they were facts I'd forgotten, and he was helpfully reminding me. I know, I'd say, I'm probably overthinking. That sentence became a shortcut. It smoothed conversations, it reassured him, it erased me. At first, it felt easier than pushing back. Pushing back required energy, and energy was already in short supply. It also required confidence that my experience would be taken seriously. I wasn't sure I had evidence for that anymore, so I adapted. I learned which topics led nowhere. I learned which emotions were inconvenient. I learned how to bring things up in ways that made them seem small enough to ignore. And when they were ignored, I told myself that was reasonable. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through repetition without consequence. No one was shouting at me. No one was calling me names. There were no ultimatums, just a slow, steady pattern of being subtly corrected about my own reality. And because it wasn't overt, I felt ridiculous for feeling affected by it. I compared myself to other women I knew, women dealing with infidelity, addiction, volatility. Their pain looked serious. Mine felt abstract, hard to explain, easy to invalidate. So I became very good at invalidating it myself. I told myself I was lucky, that I had a good man. Those relationships required compromise, that wanting emotional attunement was indulgent. I framed my needs as expectations I needed to outgrow. But the cost of that framing was distance. From him, yes, but also from myself. I began to feel like a translator inside my own life. Every feeling had to be converted into something more palatable before it could be shared. And over time, I stopped sharing altogether, not out of spite, out of efficiency. Silence was faster. Silence didn't require follow-up conversations. Silence didn't risk being misunderstood. Silence didn't invite correction. And so silence became my default. From the outside, I probably seemed calm, maybe even content. I fulfilled my roles. I showed up. I smiled at the right moments. Nothing was wrong enough to justify concern. Inside, though, something essential was being trained out of me, the reflex to speak when something didn't sit right. That reflex is delicate. It weakens when ignored. And once it weakens, other people don't have to silence you. You do it for them. I remember one moment in particular. I had made a suggestion about a decision that affected both of us. He dismissed it quickly, offering an alternative without discussion. I felt the familiar flicker of protest rise and then dissolve. I nodded, and as I did, I realized something with surprising clarity. I had just overridden myself without being asked. That scared me more than any argument would have, because arguments mean engagement. They mean both people are still reaching for something. What I was doing felt like withdrawal. Not dramatic, not visible, but real. I wasn't fighting for space anymore. I was shrinking to fit the space I'd been given. And I told myself that was maturity. Roles are rarely announced. No one sat me down and told me who I was supposed to be. There was no explicit agreement, no conversation where expectations were clearly outlined. The role I stepped into was shaped quietly through repetition, response, and what happened when I didn't resist. I was the reliable one, the one who handled things, the one who smoothed over discomfort before it reached anyone else. If there was a gap, I filled it. If something was forgotten, I remembered. If a problem arose, I solved it or softened it until it didn't bother anyone anymore. This role was rewarded, not loudly, but consistently. Things stayed calm when I played it well. People were appreciative in passing. Life flowed. And when I stepped outside that role, when I hesitated, questioned, or needed something, there was a subtle disruption. Not anger, just discomfort, a pause, a redirection. So I learned. I learned that my value came from how easily I made things for others. That being low friction was a kind of currency. That my emotional restraint was seen as strength, while my emotional needs were treated as anomalies. In my marriage, this role solidified the most. I was the wife who didn't demand, the partner who adapted, the one who could be counted on not to escalate. If there was tension, I was expected to absorb it. If there was stress, I was expected to manage it, mine and his. It wasn't that he asked me to do this. It was when things went smoother when I did. That's how roles become traps. They're comfortable, familiar, praised just enough to keep you inside them. I noticed that when friends spoke about their relationships, they described conflict as proof of passion, intensity as intimacy. I listened and nodded, thinking my calmness meant we were more evolved. But calmness isn't the same as closeness. Ours was a quiet coexistence built on my flexibility. His preferences quietly became defaults. His routines shaped our days, and I adjusted myself around them without comment, telling myself that compromise was love. The more reliable I became, the less visible I felt. People stopped checking in with me. They assumed I was fine. After all, I always was, or at least I always appeared to be. And here's the part that's difficult to admit. I began to disappear behind the role myself. When you perform a version of yourself long enough, it starts to feel real. I forgot which parts of me were adaptations and which were desires. I stopped distinguishing between what I wanted and what was expected of me. The role didn't feel oppressive. It felt efficient until one day I realized I couldn't step out of it even if I wanted to. The moment that crystallized this realization was small. We were making plans, and for once, I hesitated. I said I wasn't sure, that I might want something different. The response wasn't hostile, it was confused. But you're usually fine with this, he said. Usually. That word landed harder than any criticism because it revealed how predictable I had become, how little space there was for deviation. The role had replaced the person. I nodded again. The plan went ahead as usual, but inside something shifted. A quiet awareness surfaced. Not anger, not rebellion, just recognition. I wasn't being seen as an equal participant anymore. I was being relied upon as a function. And functions, once established, are only noticed when they fail. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no betrayal, no sharp line dividing before and after. In fact, if you had asked me that morning whether anything was wrong, I would have said no without hesitation. It was an ordinary weekday evening, the kind that blends into every other one. I was sitting alone in the living room, the lights low, the quiet not uncomfortable, just present. He was in the other room, focused on something of his own. We weren't fighting. We weren't connecting either. And for the first time, I noticed how little that bothered him. That realization landed slowly, gently, like a thought you don't resist because it feels too accurate to ignore. I wasn't missed, not in that moment, not in that space. My absence, emotional, conversational, relational, created no vacuum. Nothing shifted when I withdrew. The system functioned perfectly well without me. And something in me responded, not with hurt, but with clarity. I remember thinking very calmly, if my presence doesn't change anything, then neither does my silence. That was the shift. Up until then, my quietness had been reactive, protective, a way to avoid friction. But in that moment, silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I chose. I didn't feel dramatic. I didn't feel sad. I felt awake. I began to observe rather than participate, to notice the rhythms of our life without automatically adjusting myself to them. And what I saw was stark in its simplicity. The relationship no longer required my inner world to continue. It required my logistics, my reliability, my steadiness, not me. That night, I didn't confront him. There was nothing to confront, no specific offense, just a pattern reaching its logical conclusion. Instead, I sat with the discomfort of that realization and let it settle without trying to soften it. That was new for me. Usually, I rush to reinterpret feelings, to contextualize them into something manageable. But this time, I let the thought remain unedited. I am no longer necessary here in the way I once believed I was. And strangely, that didn't devastate me. It freed me. Over the following days, nothing changed on the surface. We moved through routines, exchanged practical words, shared space. From the outside, we looked exactly the same. Inside, though, my orientation shifted. I stopped volunteering emotional labor, stopped smoothing edges before they were felt, stopped preemptively compensating for gaps that weren't mine to fill. Not as a strategy, not as a test, as an experiment. I wanted to know what would happen if I simply stayed where I was. If I didn't lean forward, if I didn't bridge every silence, if I allowed the relationship to reflect what it actually was without my constant calibration, what I discovered was unsettling in its quietness. Nothing happened. No one asked what was wrong. No one noticed the difference between my presence and my participation. The machinery kept running, and that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a failure of communication. It wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be clarified. It was a structure that had settled into equilibrium, one that didn't include mutual curiosity anymore. That night, lying in bed beside him, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. Not resignation, not grief, just the steady awareness that something fundamental had already ended. We just hadn't marked it yet. I didn't make a decision that day. I didn't plan an exit or imagine a future without him. I simply stopped assuming that my role was to hold everything together. I let go of the illusion that my quiet endurance was preserving something fragile. What I realized instead was this: some things don't break, they dissolve. And once you see that clearly, you don't rush, you don't panic, you don't fight shadows. You begin to move differently, silently. After that shift, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been soft, apologetic almost, a way of staying agreeable, of smoothing things over before they could harden into conflict. Now, it was different. It was clean, intentional, no longer shaped by fear of disruption. I didn't announce this change. I barely acknowledged it to myself. I simply stopped filling in the gaps. When he spoke, I listened, but I didn't translate. I didn't anticipate needs before they were voiced. I didn't rush to offer reassurance or perspective or emotional scaffolding. I stayed present, but I stayed where I was. To anyone watching, I probably seemed the same: calm, reasonable, undemanding. That's the thing about strategic silence. It looks exactly like compliance to those who are used to being centered. At first, he didn't notice. Why would he? Nothing had been taken away from him that he could immediately identify. The relationship still functioned. Meals were eaten, plans were made, words were exchanged. He assumed, I think, that things were fine, maybe even better, because I was less stressed. And in a way, I was. Without the constant work of managing perception, I felt lighter. Not happier exactly, but clearer, more honest internally. I began to notice how often my former silence had been mistaken for agreement, how rarely anyone checked whether I was still choosing what I'd been choosing for years. So I let that misunderstanding stand, not to punish, not to test, but to see. What I saw was telling. Conversations stayed on the surface unless I guided them deeper. Decisions defaulted to familiar patterns unless I interrupted. Emotional distance widened, but only on my side. His experience remained largely unchanged. Silence, it turned out, was only threatening when it disrupted his comfort. As long as it didn't, it was invisible. That realization was sobering. I started keeping quiet notes, not accusations, just observations. Patterns of interaction, who followed up and who didn't. What happened when I paused instead of smoothing? What happened when I said nothing at all? This wasn't resentment. It was data, and the data was consistent. No one noticed my absence from the center because I had never been perceived as central to begin with. My silence was read as stability, as emotional maturity, as a strength. People praised it even. "You're so calm," someone said once, admiringly. They had no idea how deliberate that calm had become. The power of silence isn't in withholding words. It's in refusing to compensate for imbalance. I stopped over-explaining, stopped softening truths that weren't even being asked for anymore. I let conversations end where they naturally did, instead of reviving them with emotional labor. And slowly, something interesting happened. I stopped feeling invisible, not because others suddenly saw me, but because I stopped abandoning myself to be seen. That's when I realized silence had become more than a coping mechanism. It was leverage, not in a manipulative sense, in a structural one. I was no longer feeding a dynamic that relied on my constant presence to appear mutual. I was letting it reveal its true shape. And that shape, once revealed, couldn't be unseen. I didn't confront him. I didn't demand change. I didn't explain what I was doing. I was done explaining. Silence, when chosen consciously, isn't absence. It's containment. It's the space where clarity grows, and clarity doesn't rush. While everything on the surface appeared unchanged, something quiet and methodical was happening underneath. No one noticed because nothing looked different. That was the advantage. I didn't announce a turning point. I didn't become distant in obvious ways. I still showed up, I still participated when necessary. I still fulfilled responsibilities. From the outside, I was the same reliable presence I had always been. What changed was where my attention went. Instead of pouring it outward, I redirected it inward and forward. I began to document my life, not emotionally, practically. I took stock of the finances I had once managed on autopilot. I reviewed documents I hadn't questioned because trust had made questioning feel unnecessary. I noticed patterns in spending, decision-making, and control that I'd previously smoothed over as just how things are. I didn't feel angry as I did this. I felt precise. I learned more about the structures I was living inside than I ever had before, not because I was planning an escape, but because I wanted to understand what was actually holding everything together. And it turned out, much of it was me. I noticed how often my contributions were assumed rather than acknowledged, how systems worked because I kept them running, how little redundancy there was if I stepped back. No one noticed me noticing. At the same time, I began investing in myself quietly, not in dramatic reinvention, but in competence. I updated skills I had let stagnate. I built professional connections I'd neglected out of loyalty to stability. I started keeping my own counsel. I didn't share these developments. There was no reason to. In relationships where curiosity has faded, transparency becomes unnecessary labor. So I kept my inner movements private. I also paid attention to language. How often were they framed as we when they were really you adjusted? How my silence was interpreted as consent. How reassurance flowed one way. Once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. But I didn't correct them. Correction would have required engagement with a system that had already shown me it wasn't listening. Instead, I positioned myself. That word might sound calculated, but it wasn't cold. It was respectful to myself. I made sure I understood my options, my resources, my independence, not as a threat, as a baseline. And here's what no one noticed. I stopped needing the relationship to change in order for me to be okay. That was the real shift. Because once you stop needing validation from a structure, you can see it clearly. You stop negotiating with hope. You stop interpreting potential as reality. You deal with what is. From the outside, my quiet probably looked like compliance, like endurance, like passivity. Inside, it was alignment. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't fantasizing about confrontation. I wasn't waiting for him to realize anything. I was preparing for a life that didn't require him to change in order for me to be whole. And preparation is invisible to those who aren't looking. People assume silence means stagnation, that nothing is happening, that the quiet person is stuck, unsure, waiting. They rarely consider that silence might mean focus, that it might mean the work is already underway. I continued this way for months, calm, present, unremarkable. And because there was no conflict, no one checked in, no one asked what I was thinking. No one sensed the shift beneath the surface. That's the paradox of quiet dominance. By the time it's felt, it's already complete. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no rush of adrenaline, no triumphant moment where everything suddenly made sense. When clarity finally arrived, it did so the way truth often does, quietly, almost politely, as if it had been waiting for me to stop resisting it. I was sitting alone, reviewing documents I had already seen dozens of times before. Nothing new had been added. Nothing had changed on paper. What changed was me. For the first time, I wasn't reading through the lens of us. I wasn't filtering information through the assumption of shared intention or mutual care. I wasn't softening implications to protect a story I wanted to believe in. I was reading plainly, and what I saw was simple, unsettling, and unmistakable. The life we were living depended far more on my emotional restraint than on any shared investment. I wasn't discovering a secret. I was discovering a pattern I had previously refused to name. The leverage wasn't money. It wasn't status. It wasn't some hidden betrayal waiting to explode. It was asymmetry. I was contributing stability, foresight, and emotional regulation into a system that gave me familiarity in return, but not reciprocity. And because I had been quiet for so long, because I had adapted so seamlessly, the imbalance had gone unnoticed by everyone except me. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel calm. There's a particular kind of peace that comes when confusion ends. When you stop wondering whether you're imagining things. When the question shifts from, why does this feel wrong, to, what am I going to do with what I know? That was the reveal. Not that I had been mistreated in an obvious way, but I had been relied upon without being considered. Once I saw that, everything reorganized itself internally. I no longer framed the relationship as something broken that needed fixing. I saw it as something complete, just not mutual. And that distinction matters. You don't argue with completion. You don't negotiate with it. You don't try to repair something that's already functioning exactly as designed. You decide whether you want to continue participating in it. I didn't feel the urge to explain this realization to him or to anyone. Explanation would have been premature and unnecessary. This clarity was mine. It didn't need validation to be real. I also realized something else, just as quietly. If I spoke now, if I laid everything out, it would be framed as sudden, as surprising, as an overreaction, because from his perspective, nothing had changed. And that told me everything I needed to know about timing. Revelations don't require witnesses to be valid, but actions do require readiness. So I waited, not out of fear, out of respect, for myself and for the seriousness of what I now understood. I didn't rush to label the relationship as wrong. I didn't rewrite the past in harsher terms. I allowed nuance to remain. This wasn't about blame, it was about alignment. And I was no longer aligned. The most surprising part of this private reveal was how little emotion it carried. No rage, no grief spiral, just a steady, grounded sense of finality. Not an ending yet, but an ending already decided internally. That's what clarity does. It doesn't shout, it settles. And once it settles, you don't need to convince yourself anymore. You just move. There is a moment that comes after clarity where you can no longer pretend you're undecided. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's simply the point where every option reveals its true cost, and one of them becomes impossible to choose, no matter how familiar it is. That was where I found myself. I didn't rush the decision. I laid it out carefully, almost clinically. the way I do with everything that matters. I considered what staying would require, not in theory, but in practice. Staying meant continuing to make myself smaller. It meant accepting a life where my interior world was optional. It meant preserving comfort at the cost of authenticity. I knew I could do it. That was the problem. I was capable of enduring. I was skilled at adaptation. I could survive indefinitely in something that didn't actively harm me, but also didn't see me. And once I acknowledged that, staying stopped being a neutral choice. It became a decision against myself. Leaving, on the other hand, wasn't framed as escape. It wasn't about finding something better or someone new. It was about refusing to participate in a dynamic that required my quiet erasure to function. I weighed the consequences: disruption, discomfort, being misunderstood, being framed as sudden, cold, or ungrateful, losing the familiar shape of my life. I was aware of all of it, and still, one option felt irreversible, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. I realized that if I stayed now, after seeing what I saw, I would have to lie, not outwardly, internally. I would have to pretend I didn't know something that I did. That's the line I couldn't cross. So the decision wasn't made in a rush. It wasn't emotional. It didn't come from anger or hurt. It came from integrity. I chose the option that allowed me to remain intact. Once that choice was made internally, everything else became procedural. Not easy, but clear. I didn't announce it. I didn't test it. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I didn't seek reassurance. I began to act in alignment with the decision rather than talking about it. That's what people misunderstand about quiet endings. The decision is often the last emotional moment. Everything after is logistics, and I had already done the emotional work. What surprised me most was the absence of fear. I had expected panic, doubt, second guessing. Instead, there was a steady calm, not because I believed the path ahead would be smooth, but because I trusted Miguel to walk it without abandoning who I was. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about choosing not to disappear. And once that choice was made, it couldn't be undone. Not because I was stubborn, but because returning would require me to become someone I no longer was. That's what makes some decisions irreversible. They don't lock doors. They change who you are when you stand in front of them. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself to anyone. That urge belonged to an earlier version of me, the one who still believed clarity required consensus, or that choosing myself needed to be justified in language others found acceptable. This version didn't need that, so I moved quietly, not secretly, not deceptively, just without announcement. I handled things the same way I'd always handled responsibilities, methodically, thoroughly, without drama. The difference was that this time, every action was for me. I organized documents, not in a panicked way, just with intention. I separated what was shared from what was mine. I made sure I understood the systems I'd once managed on trust alone. I asked neutral questions where needed. I listened carefully. I didn't raise suspicions because there was nothing suspicious to raise. Everything I did was reasonable, calm, consistent with who I had always been. That's the thing about being underestimated for years. When you finally act with precision, it looks like normal behavior. At the same time, I began creating emotional distance, not through coldness, but through restraint. I stopped initiating conversations meant to restore closeness. I didn't reach for reassurance. I didn't seek validation. We still spoke. We still shared space. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I noticed how often he assumed I would continue carrying things without question, how often he relied on my presence without engaging with it. And I let those moments pass without correcting them. Not because I wanted him to fail, but because I needed to see the truth without interference. I also prepared myself for misunderstanding. I knew that when the time came, my calm would be read as detachment, that my clarity would be interpreted as suddenness, that the absence of visible struggle would confuse people. I accepted that. Not everyone gets to understand your process, especially if they weren't paying attention while it was happening. What mattered was that I understood it. I also made peace with the idea that no explanation would feel sufficient to someone who hadn't noticed the erosion. Words can't recreate years of quiet adaptation. They can't translate absence into something concrete. So I didn't plan a speech. I planned stability. I made sure I could stand on my own without scrambling, that I didn't need to plead, bargain, or justify, that when I spoke, it would be from a place of completion, not hope. That's what moving in silence really is. It's not hiding. It's finishing the work before inviting commentary. Throughout this period, there were moments when the old reflex resurfaced, the instinct to check in, to soften, to bridge gaps. Each time I noticed it, acknowledged it, and let it pass. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was practicing not rescuing a dynamic that no longer deserved my energy. By the time everything was ready, I felt steady, not triumphant, not relieved, prepared. And preparation changes the quality of your presence. You stop leaking uncertainty. You stop seeking permission. You simply are. That's when people begin to feel a shift without being able to name it. The consequences didn't arrive as an explosion. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle, a slight disorientation in the rhythm of things, small delays, missed cues, moments where something that used to happen automatically didn't. He noticed, but not consciously. There were pauses where he seemed to wait for me to step in, and I didn't. Decisions lingered longer than usual. Emotional moments passed without my familiar mediation. Nothing was wrong enough to name. That's what made it unsettling. I could feel the shift before it was acknowledged. The system we'd built, one that relied on my invisible labor, was starting to wobble, not collapse, just lose efficiency. And inefficiency is uncomfortable to people who are used to being supported without noticing the support. He began asking more questions, not about me, but about logistics, about the things I had always handled. There was a mild frustration in his voice sometimes, quickly covered, a sense of disruption he couldn't quite place. I answered when asked, briefly, factually, without filling in the emotional gaps. This wasn't punishment. It was a consequence. People often think consequences are dramatic, that they announce themselves with raised voices and final statements. But real consequences often feel like absence, like something you assumed would always be there isn't. And because there had never been a conversation about how much I was carrying, the absence felt unearned from his perspective, confusing, unfair even. I could sense the beginnings of irritation, not directed at me exactly, but at the situation, at the loss of ease. at the subtle friction that had entered our days. And still, he didn't ask the question that mattered. He didn't ask how I was. That silence spoke volumes. As things became more noticeable, there were attempts to restore normalcy. Casual gestures, light humor, familiar routines offered like peace treaties. I received them politely, but I didn't step back into the role. And that's when the emotional consequences began. Not for me, but for him. The realization that something had changed without his consent, that the comfort he relied on was no longer guaranteed, that the stability he associated with the relationship wasn't automatic anymore. This kind of realization doesn't come with clarity. It comes with unease. He didn't know what he was losing, only that something was slipping. I watched this without satisfaction, without resentment, just awareness, because I knew something he didn't yet. The change wasn't new. It was just no longer being covered up. That's what consequences really are. The unveiling of reality once compensation stops. I didn't escalate. I didn't withdraw completely. I stayed calm, present, unmistakably grounded. And that unsettled him more than anger ever would have. Anger invites engagement. Calm invites reckoning. The imbalance was now visible, not because I pointed it out, but because it could no longer hide behind my effort. And once an imbalance becomes visible, it demands a response, even if the person responding doesn't yet understand what they're responding to. By the time panic appeared, it didn't look like panic. It looked like urgency disguised as concern. Suddenly there were questions. Not the deep ones, but enough to suggest awareness. He began checking in more often, asking if I was okay, suggesting we do things together, as we used to. There was a noticeable effort to restore something he could feel slipping, even if he didn't fully understand what it was. From the outside, it might have looked like progress. From the inside, it felt late, not because change isn't possible, but because timing matters. And the timing of this shift told me something important. The motivation wasn't curiosity about me. It was discomfort with loss. He wasn't responding to my inner world. He was responding to the absence of my labor. That distinction was crucial. I listened when he spoke. I responded kindly. I didn't reject the gestures, but I also didn't lean into them the way I once would have. I didn't rush to reassure him that everything was fine. I didn't translate his effort into hope, because hope, at this point, would have been dishonest. There's a moment in some relationships where repair becomes performative, not maliciously, but reflexively. When someone senses a shift and reaches for familiar tools, without examining why those tools are suddenly needed, that's where we were. He wanted things to feel normal again, to return to the ease we once had, and I understood that desire. I had lived off it for years, but normal had required my disappearance, and I wasn't willing to offer that again. There was also a subtle change in tone, an undercurrent of anxiety he didn't name. The calm assumption that I would always be there had fractured. An uncertainty crept in where confidence once lived. Uncertainty makes people reach, sometimes too late. I could feel the window closing, not because he wasn't trying, but because the trying wasn't aligned with the truth. He wanted resolution without reckoning, and I had already reckoned. I noticed something else during this phase. How quickly the effort tired him. How hard it was to sustain curiosity when it wasn't habitual. How easily things slipped back into old patterns when I didn't actively redirect them. That told me everything I needed to know about sustainability. Repair isn't about bursts of attention. It's about a willingness to rewire how you see the other person, to become curious where you once assumed, to notice what you once took for granted. That level of change requires more than discomfort. It requires humility. And humility doesn't arrive under pressure. It arrives when someone is ready to truly see. He wasn't there, and I no longer needed him to be. That's the quiet tragedy of delayed awareness. By the time one person is ready to engage, the other has already finished grieving. I didn't feel angry during this period. I felt resolved, compassionate, even. I could see his confusion, his frustration, his desire to fix something without understanding what had broken. But I also knew that going back, even temporarily, would require me to unlearn what I now knew. And I couldn't do that. Some endings don't happen because people stop caring. They happen because caring arrives after clarity, and clarity doesn't reverse. By the time he was reaching for me, I was already standing on my own. And that's when I understood something with finality. It wasn't that he waited too long to change. It was that I waited long enough to stop waiting. When the conversation finally happened, it was almost quiet. No raised voices. No accusations thrown like weapons. No emotional overflow. Just two people, sitting across from each other, aware that something fundamental had already shifted. I didn't rehearse what I was going to say. Rehearsal belongs to uncertainty. And I wasn't uncertain. He asked, finally, what was going on. Not defensively, not aggressively, just with a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. I told him the truth, not the long version, not the emotional archive, just the part that mattered. I told him that somewhere along the way, we had stopped being curious about each other, that I had become functional instead of known, that my silence had once been protective, and then it had become definitive. He listened. I could tell he was trying to understand, but understanding something for the first time feels very different from recognizing something that's been present all along. He said he hadn't realized, that he thought we were fine, that he never meant to hurt me. I believed him. Intent and impact live in different rooms, though, and good intentions don't undo patterns that have already shaped someone's sense of self. I didn't list grievances. I didn't catalog moments. I didn't need to convince him. This wasn't a debate. I explained that this wasn't about blame, that there wasn't a single thing he could point to and fix, that what had ended wasn't love, but engagement. And once engagement fades on one side completely, it doesn't restart just because the other person becomes aware of it. He asked if we could try. The question was sincere. And for a brief moment, I let myself feel the weight of it. Not temptation, just gravity, the history, the shared life, the familiarity that had once felt like safety. Then I answered. I told him I couldn't try anymore. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally did. Trying now would mean reopening something I had already closed in order to survive intact. It would mean negotiating with a version of myself I no longer am. He didn't argue. Not really. He looked stunned, quiet, like someone realizing the ground had shifted long before they felt the tremor. There was sadness in that moment, real sadness, but it wasn't chaotic. It was clean. We talked logistics, practicalities, the shape of what came next. The conversation moved forward without spiraling backward. That's how I knew the decision was right. There was no urge to explain further, no compulsion to soften the truth so it would hurt less. The truth already was soft because it was finished. When we stood up from that conversation, nothing dramatic happened, but something ended, not with a fight, with clarity. And clarity doesn't raise its voice. After the ending, there was a strange quiet, not the heavy kind, not the aching kind people warn you about, just space. For a long time, I had filled every space with responsibility, anticipation, adjustment. Now there was room, and I had to learn how to stand in it without immediately reshaping myself to fit someone else's expectations. Who I am now isn't dramatic. I didn't reinvent my personality. I didn't become louder or harder or more guarded. I didn't swing to the opposite extreme just to prove a point. What changed was my center. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. I no longer offer silence as a peacekeeping tool. When I'm quiet now, it's because I'm listening, not because I'm disappearing. I've learned to notice when my presence is treated as optional and to respond accordingly. Not with withdrawal or punishment, but with discernment. I still value steadiness. I still believe in kindness, but I no longer mistake endurance for virtue. I also no longer over-explain myself. That's been one of the most profound shifts. I don't feel compelled to make my boundaries understandable to people who benefited from me not having any. I state what's true and allow others to interpret it however they need to. Their interpretation isn't my responsibility anymore. Emotionally, I feel lighter, but not naive. There's a groundedness that comes from having chosen myself once and knowing I can do it again if necessary. I trust my perceptions now. When something feels off, I don't rush to disprove myself. I stay with the discomfort long enough to learn from it. That has changed every relationship in my life, not by making me colder, but by making me clearer. I'm more present now than I ever was when I was trying to hold everything together. Presence requires boundaries. Without them, it turns into performance. I'm no longer performing. The most unexpected part of this chapter is the absence of bitterness. I don't replay arguments that never happened. I don't fantasize about being understood retroactively. I accept that some people only see you clearly once you stop compensating for their blindness. And that's okay. My life now isn't louder or more exciting than it was before, but it's honest. And honesty has a quiet stability that doesn't depend on anyone else's participation. I've learned that being chosen by yourself is a powerful thing. It doesn't inflate you. It anchors you. I don't regret how long I stayed. That version of me did the best she could with what she understood at the time. But I also don't romanticize endurance anymore. Love that requires erasure isn't love, it's accommodation. And I'm done accommodating myself out of my own life. There's a temptation when a relationship ends quietly to treat it as if nothing really happened. No betrayal, no cruelty, no clear moment of rupture. Just two people drifting apart and calling it unfortunate timing or incompatibility. But silence can be an ending just as real as any argument. What I learned through this experience is that relationships don't require explosions to be unsustainable. They only require imbalance and the quiet agreement of one person to keep compensating for it. For a long time, I believed that being calm meant being strong, that not asking for much made it easier to love, that if I just held steady long enough, the relationship would eventually meet me where I was. What I didn't understand then is that love doesn't grow in spaces where curiosity has died, and it can't survive where one person is consistently translated instead of truly heard. The moral of this story isn't leave at the first sign of discomfort. It's not never be patient. And it's certainly not silence is power in some performative sense. The real lesson is this: pay attention to what your silence is doing. If it's creating space for reflection, that's healthy. If it's protecting your integrity while you gain clarity, that's wise. But if it's slowly erasing you so a dynamic can remain comfortable, that silence has a cost. And eventually that cost comes due. My marriage didn't end because anyone was cruel. It ended because mutual engagement faded, and only one of us noticed, and only one of us adapted. By the time the imbalance became visible, it was already complete. That doesn't make anyone a villain. It just makes the ending honest. If there's anything I hope you take from this story, it's this: you don't need a dramatic reason to choose yourself. You don't need permission to stop disappearing. And you don't need to wait until resentment turns loud to honor what you already know quietly. Endings don't always come with fireworks. Sometimes they arrive as clarity. And clarity, when you allow it, is enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt yourself growing quieter in a relationship that looked fine from the outside, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever realized, in hindsight, that something ended not with a fight, but with silence? Share your thoughts in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.